do people have a right in America to think unpopular ideas, crazy ideas, or even racist ideas?
You can't have the freedom to be right without the freedom to be wrong. And, like I said before, I think it's valuable if there are, as my mentor Harvey Silverglate, who I mentioned before, put it, his way of putting it very simply, I want to know who the Nazis are in the room. He's Jewish. I want to know who I don't turn my back to. So even just from that informational standpoint, but like the things debated out in the marketplace of ideas is really important. But like I said, it's also just important to not open the door so that power can decide what opinions are okay and which ones aren't. And unfortunately, I think we've opened that door more than I thought we ever would in my lifetime as a First Amendment lawyer. And I'm trying to argue for closing it back up.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for being with us for another episode of American Potential. Of course, one of the topics that we love to talk about, we don't talk about it enough, is freedom of speech. Now, according to the Annenberg Constitution Day Civics Survey in 2021, 74% of Americans could name freedom of speech as a right in the First Amendment. Freedom of religion was second at 56%, and freedom of the press was third at 50%. But only 20% could name the right to petition the government as a freedom in the First Amendment. Now, freedom of speech captures the essence that every individual has the right to express their thoughts, their ideas, their beliefs without government interference or censorship. Now, today's guest went to college to become a First Amendment lawyer, but has also added best-selling author to his resume. He's been published in multiple publications. He frequently appears on TV and radio programs, and he's testified before the U.S. House and Senate about free speech on college campuses. I want to welcome Greg Lukianoff, who is the president and CEO of Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Greg, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for saying my name so well.
Well, it's funny. I looked it up. Now, I looked it up. Now, I do have some friends who know you, so I did ultimately ask them. But it's not often said correctly, I've noticed.
Well, it's the fault of the fact that when my family came to this country, my dad only came here in the 50s. And the way they spell, it's a pretty common Ukrainian/Russian name, and it's Lukyanov is the way they spell it now. I tried to urge my family to change the spelling, but now I've been stuck being, hey, Lukianoff.
That's great. So let's start with your organization, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE. Tell us about that. What does your foundation do?
Sure. I couldn't be prouder of FIRE. It was founded in 1999 by Alan Charles Kors, one of the leading scholars of the Enlightenment and of Voltaire, who was at Penn University, at University of Pennsylvania, and Harvey Silverglate, still a very well-known civil liberties lawyer and criminal defense attorney. We were founded in order to protect freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus, but in 2022, last year, we changed our name to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression from Individual Rights and Education, because we wanted people to understand that in order to save campus, we have to save the rest of society. And in order to save the rest of society, we have to save campus. So campus will still be a major, and is still a major focus of us and of mine. But we've now started doing lawsuits off campus defending free speech rights of everyone.
Yeah, and it used to be that there were other organizations, I think, that would step up and fight some of these battles. But I think over the last many years, it seems like there have been fewer organizations that are willing to step in and defend free speech rights of average everyday citizens.
Well, in a nonpartisan way.
Right.
Definitely, it's one of those things where, it's easy to defend speech you agree with. There was something really irresponsible written in the LA Times that was a columnist saying that fire only defends speech it agrees with. And I'm like, apparently you're under the impression that we agree with all speech then, because if you look at our record, we've defended everybody, no matter how unsympathetic, and on both sides of basically every hot button issue in the United States.
Yeah. So what made you want to even go to college, become a First Amendment lawyer in the first place?
Well, my parents are my parents are immigrants, and it's a very kind of typical sort of first generation kid appreciation of some of the things that America does right that sometimes people who are fourth or fifth generation don't seem to get.
Right.
So I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of other immigrant kids, and if you're an immigrant kid, that means there's a good chance you're coming from a country that's authoritarian, totalitarian, or otherwise, doesn't really solidly guarantee your rights, because frankly, that's an awful lot of the rest of the world. So we grew up with a special appreciation for the First Amendment being something special, like in the U.S. But I was also working class, and working class seems to kind of get these issues a little better. And then finally, when I was in college, I was a student journalist. And if you ever want to see free speech in action, work as an editor in a student newspaper and see how often people come into your office and demand that you fire this reporter or rescind that article. And you start putting together, it's like, wow, this has to be really expansive in order to work. So I went to law school specifically to study First Amendment law. I took every class at Stanford Law School offered on free speech. When I ran out, I did 6 credits on the censorship during the Tudor Dynasty, an independent study I made up. And I interned at the ACLU of Northern California back in '99. So when Harvey Silverglade asked the then dean of Stanford who she'd recommend for this new organization, FIRE, to make their first legal director, it remains the greatest compliment I've ever received that she mentioned me by name.
That's great. What a great story. Now, Greg, just at its basic level, I mean, why is free speech so important?
Oh man, I mean, freedom of speech. This is it. I can spend all day talking about the various philosophies of why free speech is important. So I'll cut right to my idiosyncratic take on it,
Okay.
and I call it the pure informational theory on freedom of speech, which I sometimes refer to as the lab in the looking glass, that everything about humanity is worth knowing. And what I'm getting at there is that you can't know the world as it is without knowing what people really think, full stop. That essentially, if the project of human knowledge is to know the world as it is, and to understand the universe, you can't get anywhere near it if you don't know what people actually think. And this is one of the reasons why, it's a utilitarian argument for freedom of speech, but it's basically means that any opinion is worth knowing. Certainly anything that anyone actually believes is worth knowing. And I offer it kind of to overcome to a degree what I think are arguments that have been sort of whittled down, particularly on campus, to now mean something, a relatively weak protection of freedom of speech. And I think that this is partially because people haven't been arguing back against them as well. Also partially because attitudes about free speech have really changed over the decades, on campus. And I want to remind people that even before just getting to things like natural law, you can make an argument that's utilitarian, but nonetheless means you think every single opinion should be protected.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we talk about people get into tribes in the United States, right? There's the conservative tribe and the liberal tribe. And it seems like people tend to want to, protect the free speech rights of their tribe, but that's easy. Right. That's not what the First Amendment is about, is to protect speech that you agree with. Right. It's very valuable to protect speech you disagree with. Mm-hmm. Isn't that the case?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing more natural to defend the free speech rights of people you agree with. That's right. Also just self-interest. I don't want to go to jail. I don't like these people. It's a much higher level to be obnoxious about, of moral sophistication, to actually say, the old summary of the views of Voltaire, which is actually someone said summarizing his point of view in 1910. I may disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And while that sounds rightfully that's considered noble, I do think that also, well, of course you should, because we're a democratic republic. Like, what on earth would that mean if you can't actually say some opinions, that you're no longer truly representative of the people if some opinions are off limits.
Yeah, there's so many folks, I think, today that are unwilling to pay the price and to stand up when they see their own free speech being violated. And I can think of it. We had Joe Kennedy on talking about kind of his case and going to the Supreme Court with that, and the price that he paid, the personal price that he paid. There aren't a lot of people in America today, in my view, that have the courage and the fortitude to stand up and fight. But that's really important. That's the only way free speech will survive in the United States, is if we have people, heroes really, who stand up and defend free speech rights.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of what my new book with Ricky Schlott, Canceling the American Mind, is arguing is something beyond First Amendment law, which is free speech culture. And free speech culture can't work without courage. You have to be willing to risk your reputation at minimum in order to actually live in an honest way with your opinions. So I think that there is sort of an embarrassing lack of courage around these issues sometimes, but there's also an embarrassing amount of certainty around issues that, to say the least, are not settled.
Yeah. When we talk about having that courage to stand up and do that, there are groups, yours being one of them. There's several others that will help, in a legal capacity, maybe help someone have the courage to do that. But they still pay that personal price. But that free speech only survives if we have people who are willing to stand up and pay that price. And I want to ask you about, when you talk about kind of this just beyond what the First Amendment means. We've talked on this show a lot about the First Amendment being, government doesn't have the right to infringe upon your freedom of speech.
Necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah, right. And it doesn't mean that, Twitter or Facebook doesn't have the right to shut down certain things. But we should all value a culture of free speech, even if it isn't the government. And even though I could shut down someone else's speech, it's not in the tradition of America to do so. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no. I mean, this is something that there's a great book called The People's Darling Privilege that talks about how even though the First Amendment was not strongly interpreted, this might surprise some of your listeners, until 1925 and after, that there was a strong sort of folk tradition of freedom of speech that actually did a pretty decent job of protecting it, through a lot of the 19th century. Not perfectly, of course. And I think that when people fall back too much on relying on First Amendment law to be the end-all be-all of freedom of speech, they're missing a huge chunk of it that has nothing to do with government coercion. It comes to some of our duties as a citizen to be like, listen, you have just as much right to your opinion as I do, even if I think it's abhorrent. In fact, again, it's useful to know that my fellow citizens think things that are abhorrent. You're not safer from reality for knowing less about it. It is one of my arguments. But when I try to talk about what the parameters of free speech culture include, I have found that one of the ways to show that Americans already know this is by pointing out idioms that weren't very common, sayings that weren't very common when, say, my co-author, who's 23, was around, but were very common to me and you, which are everybody's entitled to their opinion, to each their own, walk a mile in a man's shoes, don't judge a book by its cover. All of these things are small d democratic ideals that actually let you live in a free society while respecting other people. We seem to have lost an awful lot of respect for the right of each other to their opinions. And one of the things that I think really helped create this, unfortunately, are bad ideas that have been brewing on campus for long before my entire career. But I've spent 22 years trying to warn people about them. Yeah.
I mean, you talked about bad ideas. There are some people who believe that, free speech doesn't protect bad ideas.
Yeah.
But free speech actually does protect bad ideas, doesn't it?
Oh, of course it does. How do you get to good ideas? And what do we define as a bad idea? Like, like I said, I talk about this. The fact that the world is not run by lizard people who live under the Denver airport. I'm pretty comfortable that's true. Right. The fact that your girlfriend thinks that it is, the fact that your uncle, the fact that your politicians think there are, that's worth knowing, So things that we can say factually aren't true are still worth knowing is absolutely true. But also, when people talk about just going after misinformation or disinformation, I just want to put my hand, do this. I just like, what? Do you have any idea how hard it is to know what's true? Jonathan Rauch I'm lucky to say, has become a good friend. And he wrote a book called Kindly Inquisitors back in 1993, one of the first real intellectual defenses of freedom of speech in the modern age of PC. But he also recently wrote a book called The Constitution of Knowledge. And the whole thing is no, it's hard to know what's actually going on at any given minute. The idea that we can just decide, oh, well, this is true. You usually end up linking yourself to the biases of the people in charge. If you decide to give power decisions over misinformation, disinformation. And we have a chapter in Canceling the American Mind on COVID, making the point that, hey, even if you're wrong, you should have a free speech right to be wrong. But let's take a minute to pause and reflect how many people were actually right about things about COVID who ended up getting treated like they were saying blasphemy and had to shut up. And how it doesn't make it more or less protected, but it does make it especially galling when you see a case like Jennifer Say, at Levi's Jeans, who lost her career essentially because she argued that lockdowns are going to be bad for kids and they're going to hit disadvantaged kids the most. And this was treated like this was some kind of horrible heresy. Meanwhile, now everybody, the experts in general, kind of are like, oh, well, yeah, actually, it turns out she was right.
Right.
But so putting particularly government in the role of arbiter of truth is a disastrously short-sighted and foolish idea.
Well, and that was going to be my next question is if you assume that there is one truth,
yep.
Who gets to be the arbiter of that truth? And why does the government get to be that arbiter?
Yeah, it's especially because although we argue for a culture of free speech, there's no two ways about it. The government taking on that role is one of the scariest roles that you can imagine. Now, we are concerned, of course, that social media plays such a big role in our daily lives, that when people say that there's censorship on social media and that's harmful, I don't disagree. And that's one of the reasons why when Twitter, when Elon Musk took on the formerly named Twitter, that I wrote him a big letter saying, listen, we have lots of advice on how you can actually, have free speech, even in an environment where the First Amendment doesn't require it. So I definitely do get that argument, but I am worried that there are attempts to force this through legislation, basically saying that we're going to take the law and we're going to mandate free speech on Twitter, Facebook, etc. And I think I don't think you'll like where that actually ends up in the end. I think it may start with something like people are entitled to their opinion, and it's going to end except for once the government has its hands in it. That's troubling. Yeah.
And isn't that the government basically telling a company we're going to infringe upon your free speech rights or your
100%.
Right. Yeah.
And I like them to voluntarily adopt it, and I'll make the argument for it. But the government coming in and demanding, that you can't have editorial power over social media, I think the cure would end up being worse than the disease, at least in the long run.
Yeah, that would be there's some people who would make that argument about Facebook or Twitter or some of the social media platforms that are out there, but they would probably never make that argument that the government ought to come in and moderate content at a newspaper.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know why it would be any different. Is it okay though? And we've had court cases about this, and so far they've gone swimmingly well. But is it okay for the government to step into these social media companies and sort of urge them to start banning this and say that this is untrue? That's where it crosses the line, right, of the First Amendment.
Oh, yeah. No. That was something that I was a little bit embarrassed, frankly, for some other people in the First Amendment space who came in defense of the government right to jawbone social media companies into engaging in the censorship that the government actually approves of. In Missouri v. Biden, for example, I was just like, oh, man, this is, you shouldn't say that one out loud too much, because yeah, fine. Like, can the government say, does it have its own bully pulpit? Can it say we think the following things aren't true? Can they argue back? Of course they can. They have the biggest platform in the world, for goodness sakes. It's the president's office. Should they be behind the scenes browbeating social media companies into disapproving speech that the government currently thinks is untrue, which is bound to change, by the way? No, that's very, very dangerous. And we think that the opinions reining some of that in are good as well.
And doesn't it take courage, as we talked about having courage to stand up for free speech? Wouldn't it take courage on the part of some of these executives at these platforms to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that? And that, I mean, you kind of talked about Elon Musk. You talked about sending a letter. How's he doing, by the way, with X and standing up for free speech rights in the tradition of the First Amendment? It's been a bit mixed, but not as bad as his critics like to say. I will say one thing that disappointed me a little bit was one of his rules is saying that he'll follow local law. And of course, that means following law in other countries that don't protect freedom of speech. Mm-hmm. And so there was a bad case in India where they're clamping down on a documentary that was very unflattering to Modi in India. And, basically the argument was we have to follow local law, even if we don't like it. And I was somewhat impressed to discover that actually pre-Musk, Twitter actually usually would put up a bit of a fight about that. What I mean is to say, like, listen, we're not going to do this locally. Like, we're gonna resist calls from these governments to do that. Now, I think that part of the reason why they can't is because they reduce the amount of staff tremendously at X, maybe making it practically impossible. But I do think that was an example of where I'm kind of like, yeah, like ultimately you can come to the conclusion at the end that you really had no choice, but you should push back. And when it comes to kind of like when I think about ways that Twitter could be better, I've been talking a lot about, I wish there was a stream within X that was about truth seeking. It's something we talk a lot about in the book, the idea that cancel culture can never get you to truth. It can only let you feel like you won an argument without persuading anybody or even making any rational arguments. And I think that if we had a forum that was, people can make whatever argument they want, and but then back it up, but were constricted to the rules of good debate and discussion, we could actually fix some major problems in a way that where all that cognitive energy is currently just wasted on, ad hominems at the moment. Do people have a right in America to think unpopular ideas, crazy ideas, or even racist ideas? Oh, absolutely. The idea that the law can have any say in what you think is a totalitarian idea. And the freedom to be wrong, you can't have the freedom to be right without the freedom to be wrong. And, like I said before, I think it's valuable if there are, as my mentor, Harvey Silverglate, who I mentioned before, put it, his way of putting it very simply, I want to know who the Nazis are in the room. He's Jewish. I want to know who I don't turn my back to. So even just from that informational standpoint, but like the things debated out in the marketplace of ideas is really important. But like I said, it's also just important to not open the door so that power can decide what opinions are okay and which ones aren't. And unfortunately, I think we've opened that door more than I thought we ever would in my lifetime as a First Amendment lawyer. And I'm trying to argue for closing it back up. Sure. And being wrong. I mean, speech that's clearly wrong is protected. If I say, and I'll make this statement, 2 + 2 = 6. I mean, is that protected speech? Well, sure. I would hope so, because that would mean every a 5-year-old who got it wrong would be in serious trouble. The misinformation. I can't say strongly enough. For a long time, the biggest sort of marketing ploy for massive censorship was hate speech. That essentially, yes, it sounds nice to go after hateful speech, but when you see how it's actually put in action on campus, hate speech has been invoked as the refutation of free speech going back to the 80s. And when you look at what's going on campus, it's overwhelmingly justified, at least initially, under the idea of hate speech.
More recently, the biggest exception that you could drive the drive a truck through is misinformation, disinformation, like I mentioned, and I think that it gets almost like automatic. Well, untrue things shouldn't be allowed, and it's like, okay, you have much more faith in people in power to decide to be able to distinguish between what is true and what's in my interest.
Yeah. We talked about FIRE and your origins on campus free speech, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Has that driven us? Has the sort of suppression of free speech and that becoming acceptable for many people across America? Is that what drove us to the place in culture today where we are? Like, it became acceptable on college campuses somehow amongst the elites on college campuses. Is that drive us to where we are today?
I think we got to where we are today through a number of problems. But when it comes to the problems that we face in terms of attitudes about freedom of speech and whether or not things should be protected, I think that's very much a product of campus. And I think one of the subtler harms that we talk about in canceling the American mind is that it destroys faith and expertise. So I always go to the example of Carol Hooven at Harvard. Carol Hooven wrote a book called Testosterone. She is an evolutionary psychologist. She, has experience working with chimpanzees, for example. And she went on Fox News to explain that, yes, we should be kind and compassionate towards trans people. Yes, she even went so far as to say we should use their pronouns. Of course, my argument is you can't be compelled to. That would be a First Amendment violation by itself. But then also said the biological sex is real and we can't pretend it's not. And this led to a campaign started by a DEI administrator at Harvard, to get her punished in some way. And it followed all the typical cancel culture dynamics. Students issue a petition, administrators get mad, friends kind of won't say anything in her defense. She feels utterly alienated and isolated. A university isn't particularly brave in the face of the criticism either. And she eventually, she explains that she, had suicidal ideation for the first time in her life, and she left campus. Now that's, as she came, Steve Pinker invited her back, and now she's, basically it led towards the end of her career at Harvard. Now that's really bad from an individual standpoint, but think about what that does to faith and expertise. If the next time, some Harvard educated, or for that matter, for anywhere in the academy comes out and says, you know what, biological sex isn't real, it's a spectrum, the public isn't stupid. And they look and go, last time anyone said any different, they got canceled. And that's if it happens only once. If that threat happened only once, it becomes absolutely understandable to not trust the next person to be objective. But in the case in canceling, we talk about over 1,000 examples of people targeting professors, with about 2/3 of them getting punished in some way, over almost 200 of them getting fired. I think plus 40 of them who were tenured, which was unheard of, and 1 in 6 professors saying they've been investigated or threatened with investigation for their academic freedom. I mean, we're in a very serious situation that needs some very serious reform.
Are we making progress on campuses? I think there has been pushback over the last decade on some of these free speech violations, I think, on college campuses. Are we making progress there?
FIRE has been very effective at saving individual professors and individual students from being canceled or otherwise censored. We've been able to help reduce the number of speech codes dramatically on campus, but that's all of the good news. The bad news is that we need a much more serious level of reform if we're to sort of save academia from itself. We spend about 1/3 of the book talking about potential solutions, and we talk about that in parenting and in K through 12 reform, how to keep your corporation out of the culture war, and reforms that you can do in higher education. But I do actually think that we should be thinking really quite big. I've said quite often that I think one of the things that could really help America would be if there was some way to prove you were, if there was some super duper hard test that you had to pass to show that you learned everything a humanities student at Harvard might have learned in the 1950s when the demands were much higher, and offer it for free online somewhere. And that could tell employers, essentially, this is the hardest working person out there. And it would allow them to totally skip these institutions that I think have terrible ideas about freedom of speech and are producing way too much of America's sort of like leadership class.
Yeah. How about just that social pressure that you're talking about, I think is a difficult thing. Again, I think takes courage for people to stand up and swim upstream on that social pressure. But let's talk about the difference between that and, say, an employer. I mean, what does an employer have the ability to say, look, you can't wear that at the store. You can't say that during work hours. Talk about that a little bit.
The employer, from a First Amendment perspective, and we fought for this, for our whole existence, have the right to hire and fire who they want, and they can have good reasons or bad reasons. What I did start to get worried about, though, over the years was if we end up in a situation where every employer thinks they're not just a widget factory, but also a widget factory and an organization with a political cause, that starts to look like a situation. And by the way, this might sound like what the country was starting to look like in 2020 and 2021, where you can have a job only if you keep your mouth shut about your actual opinion. So even though I want companies to continue to have the First Amendment, right to decide these things, I want to caution them to think about what kind of world they're creating. The case is, if you disagree with the boss's political opinion, you can be fired, and that's normal. That's not a healthy place to end up, because basically you end up having, the freedom of speech almost only in theory. That essentially you have freedom of speech, but you can't feed your family. So even though so that's one of the difficult things about cultural arguments, is you're not saying something that's as easy as a black and white, but we're saying, please try to make sure that your employees still know that they have the right to speak out on issues they care about. Sometimes you'll hate what they actually have to say, but it's a healthier republic if you. It's also a healthier company, frankly, if you're willing to hire people who have points of view all over the spectrum.
You talked a little bit about your new book, The Canceling of the American Mind. Tell us a little bit about the book itself. It sounds like an amazing read. I actually have just ordered it. But
thank you.
Tell folks where they can get that and a little bit more about the book.
Sure. Yeah. Canceling of the American Mind is my book with 23-year-old journalist Ricky Schlott. It's nice to write a book with a Gen Z woman, since so much of my previous book, Coddling the American Mind, was about issues faced by Gen Z women. So the book tries to do three things. One, show not only is cancel culture real, it's amazing you still have to do that with some people, but show that it's happening on a historic scale, which we do. Two, get people to think about it as a cheap way to win arguments without actually winning arguments, and to situate it in like an entire lazy system of argumentation that gets closer to truth. And then three, offer a lot of potential starting points for solutions. And it just came out just last week. When I'm feeling a little snarkier, the way I say it is like, that person in your life who always told you that cancel culture isn't real? This makes a great stocking stuffer, like by all means, because not only do we give tons of examples, quote tons of really persuasive data, we also even do things like we open every chapter with a quote from someone famous about cancel culture. And so we have the Pope, Barack Obama, James Carville, Helena Bonham Carter, and Taylor Swift, talking about the problem of cancel culture. So the idea that kind of the people who continue to say cancel culture is some kind of hoax are just really raising their hand to say, you might not want to take that person seriously anymore. And
where can they get the book if they want to buy the book?
Anywhere. It should be out in bookstores. Definitely, Barnes and Noble, Amazon.com. It's available everywhere. It's hopefully, and Great. If it's not available at your local library, chastise them until they get it.
Sounds like a good plan. If anybody wants to learn a little bit more about the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE, where can they go to learn more?
Thefire.org, and in particular, check out our campus free speech rankings. It's the most comprehensive, by far, ranking of schools according to freedom of speech. Some schools do well, like University of Virginia and University of Chicago, and some schools finish dead last, like Harvard did, 248 out of 248, and boy, did they earn it.
Yeah, we actually did an episode. Casey Maddox joined me, and we kind of walked through the FIRE rankings, and we did a show. We actually compared it to the basketball tournament, and who won each division and those sorts of things. It was pretty good episode of the show. Yeah, that's great stuff, and that's information that parents should want to know before they send their money to those colleges and universities as well.
100%.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks, Greg, for joining us. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Now, listen, I talked before about Joe Kennedy being a hero. Greg is a hero, too. And I want people to understand what FIRE is doing is defending and protecting the First Amendment and our free speech rights. And so I hope you will help them out. You will learn more about them. You'll do whatever you can to help them be successful, because they're out there fighting for all of us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.